The silence should have been the first warning sign. Captain Scott Bowman stood motionless beside his woodpile, staring at the small, dark shape that didn't belong in the pristine white emptiness of his Alaskan trapline. The February blizzard screamed through the trees at -30, but all he could hear was the ragged rhythm of his own breathing, the same shallow pattern that had kept him alive through the ambush that killed his entire squad. What he found that night would save his life in ways that no therapy ever could. The tiny creature he mistook for an abandoned husky puppy would grow into something that would make even the most experienced wildlife biologists question everything they knew about the boundary between wild and tame. But on that frozen evening, Scott had no idea he was about to become the chosen family of one of the Arctic's most formidable predators. The bundle of black fur was dying when Scott dropped to his knees in the snow. No bigger than his gloved hand, the creature's body felt cold as stone, its chest barely rising beneath silver-tipped fur that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. Before we continue this extraordinary journey, if stories about unexpected healing and bonds that transcend every boundary speak to your soul, consider subscribing to our channel. Every subscription helps us share more of these powerful tales that prove family isn't defined by species, but by the souls who choose to save each other. Your support spreads the truth that sometimes the wildest connections forge the strongest healing. Scott hadn't planned to check the trapline that day. The February blizzard had turned Alaska's interior into a howling void of white. Temperatures plunging to -30, the kind of cold that could kill in minutes. But routines were all he had left. Routines kept him from thinking about the blood in Afghan dust, about Martinez's final breath, about the radio silence that meant his entire squad was gone and he was the only one who'd made it out. The trapline ran 2 miles through black spruce and frozen muskeg. Scott had walked it every morning for 9 months, ever since he'd driven north until the road ended, and kept going until he found a place remote enough that no one would hear the gunshot when he finally worked up the courage. He didn't actually trap anything. He just walked because staying in the cabin meant drowning in memories that had teeth. The small black shape against his woodpile shouldn't have been there. Scott stopped mid-step, his combat instincts cataloging details automatically. Too small for a bear cub, wrong coloring for fox. The shape trembled, barely visible against the snow. What he found was a puppy dying in the cold. Black fur with strange silver-tipped guard hairs that caught the dim light like frost. Eyes sealed shut, paws disproportionately large for its body. The creature was hypothermic, its tiny form rigid where it had crawled against the woodpile seeking shelter the wilderness refused to give. Scott's first thought was clinical, let nature take its course. His second thought came with hands already moving, tucking the frozen puppy inside his parka against his thermal shirt. The small body felt like ice against his chest, like holding death itself. He ran for the cabin, legs pumping through drifts, lungs burning, the puppy motionless against his ribs, just like Martinez had been motionless those last 50 meters. Inside, Scott's hands moved with the efficiency of combat medicine. He heated towels on the wood stove, laid the puppy on sheepskin near the fire's warmth, began gentle massage to restore circulation without shocking the system. The creature didn't respond, barely breathed. For 2 hours, Scott knelt beside it and refused to let it die. He warmed goat's milk and loaded an eyedropper, forcing drops between unresponsive lips, massaged the tiny limbs, kept talking because in combat you talked to the wounded, kept them present through your voice when everything else was failing. "Come on, kid, don't quit on me. Not today." The absurdity registered somewhere in the back of his mind. A man who'd driven to the edge of the earth to disappear, begging a dying puppy to live. A man who couldn't save his squad, now pouring everything into saving something that probably wouldn't make it anyway. Then the puppy's chest expanded, drew one full breath, another. Its eyes cracked open, revealing irises of molten amber that glowed in the firelight. Something in Scott's chest cracked open too, just a sliver, just enough to let in light. "Ghost," he whispered, watching those silver-tipped markings shimmer like frost on black water. "That's where I'll call you, Ghost." The puppy made a sound then, not quite a whimper, something deeper and stranger that resonated in Scott's hollow chest. Probably just an abandoned husky runt, Scott told himself, common enough in mushing country when breeders culled the weak ones. The oversized paws meant nothing. Lots of northern breeds had big feet. That first night, Scott laid out blankets beside the wood stove and settled in for a vigil. Ghost curled against his side, impossibly small, impossibly fragile, somehow still breathing. The blizzard screamed outside, but Scott didn't hear it. He was talking, soft and steady, words spilling out that he hadn't spoken in 9 months. "I had a squad once, 12 good men. Martinez, he was from San Antonio, had a daughter named Elena. Thompson collected comic books. Garcia could fix anything with duct tape and spite." His voice cracked. "They're all gone now, every single one. And I'm still here, and I don't know why." Ghost shifted closer, pressed against Scott's ribs where his heart still beat despite everything. "But I kept you alive today. That's something, right? That's one thing I didn't fail at." For the first time in 9 months, Scott fell asleep without reaching for the Glock on the counter. He had something to do tomorrow, something to keep alive, something that needed him. Outside, fresh snow covered Ghost's tracks completely, erasing every trace of where he'd come from or what he really was. The blizzard didn't stop for 3 days. Scott barely noticed. His world had contracted to the space around the wood stove, where the black puppy fought for every breath like it was storming a fortified position. Scott knew that fight. He'd lived it. The difference was, Ghost seemed determined to win. By the second morning, the puppy could lift its head. By afternoon, it was lapping warmed goat's milk from a shallow dish Scott had fashioned from a tuna can. The amber eyes tracked Scott's movements across the cabin with unsettling intelligence, watching, learning, calculating in ways that reminded Scott of the village dogs in Kandahar that always seemed to know which soldiers carried rations and which ones carried death. This was mushing country, and abandoned husky runts weren't uncommon. Breeders culled litters, kept the strong, left the weak to whatever mercy the wilderness offered. Scott told himself that's what this was, some musher's reject that had crawled away from a dog lot, seeking warmth, finding Scott's woodpile instead of the death it was probably born for. The oversized paws made sense for a husky. The black coat with those strange silver-tipped guard hairs could be Malamute in the bloodline. The facial structure, narrower than he'd expect, could be explained by malnutrition. Scott was good at explaining things away. He'd explained away the tremor in his hands, the way he slept with the Glock, the fact that he'd driven 2,300 miles to live alone in a place where the darkness lasted 20 hours a day. Explaining away one unusual puppy was easy. "Ghost," Scott said on the 3rd night, watching the puppy curl into an impossibly tight ball beside the stove. "You move like you're not even there, all that dark fur and those pale markings, like frost on coal." The puppy's ears swiveled toward his voice but didn't open its eyes. Something about that stillness, that silent acknowledgement, settled into Scott's chest like recognition. He found himself talking, words he hadn't spoken aloud since the memorial service he'd attended via satellite phone, because he was still in country, still waiting for someone to explain how 12 men under his command had walked into an ambush so perfect it was like the mountains themselves had swallowed them whole. "Had a squad once," Scott said to the sleeping puppy, to the darkness, to ghosts that would never answer. "Martinez, he was point. Best natural scout I ever saw, could read terrain like it was talking to him. Thompson, on comms, always had a joke even when everything was turning to hell. Nguyen, Oakes, Ramirez, Chen, Kowalski, Davis, Mitchell, Parker, Webb." Scott's voice cracked on the last name. Webb had been 19, had a girl back home who sent letters that smelled like cheap perfume. Webb had shown Scott pictures of her, talked about the wedding they'd plan when he got back, the life they'd build. Webb had died with his eyes open, staring at sky that offered no answers. "I should have seen it," Scott continued, the words pouring out like infection from a lanced wound. "Should have read the terrain better. Should have called for air support earlier. Should have done something different, something that would have meant I wasn't the only one who made it out." Ghost stirred then, uncurling from his tight ball. He stood on unsteady legs, wobbled across the 3 feet of space between them, and climbed directly onto Scott's lap with the determination of something conquering a mountain. The puppy was surprisingly heavy for something so small, all dense muscle and thick bone. He turned twice, settled into Scott's crossed legs, and placed his oversized head directly over Scott's heart. The weight was real, the warmth was real. The steady breathing against his chest was the first real thing Scott had felt since he'd carried Martinez's body through smoke and dust, and the knowledge that being alive meant being guilty forever. Scott's hand found Ghost's fur, ran through the coarse guard hairs to the soft undercoat beneath. The puppy made a sound, low and rumbling, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, something that vibrated through Scott's ribcage like a frequency he'd forgotten existed. "Yeah," Scott whispered. "You and me, Ghost. We're the ones who made it out." Outside, the blizzard finally broke. Inside, something in Scott that had been waiting to die decided, for now, to live. The snowshoe hare never had a chance. Scott watched from the cabin window as 8-week-old Ghost dropped into a crouch that belonged in a nature documentary, not in the play behavior of a puppy. The hare had been browsing willow shoots 20 yards from the woodpile, white against white, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to see what didn't want to be seen. Ghost saw it immediately. What happened next lasted 3 seconds, but would replay in Scott's mind for weeks. Ghost's approach was liquid silence, each paw placed with precision that seemed impossible for something barely 12 weeks alive. No excited puppy bounce, no clumsy enthusiasm, just calculated stalking that closed the distance to 5 feet before the hare's ears swiveled in alarm. The explosion of speed was breathtaking. Ghost launched like coiled violence, front paws pinning the hare mid-leap, jaws closing around the neck with surgical precision. One shake, one sharp crack. Done. Ghost carried his prize back to the porch, dropped it at Scott's feet, and sat with blood on his muzzle and something ancient glowing in those amber eyes that said, "I am what I am, and you already know." Scott did know, had known maybe from the beginning, but knowing and accepting were 2 different countries with no bridge between them. That night Ghost lifted his head and howled, not the playful yips and barks Scott had heard from sled dogs in town. This was something that came from the bottom of the earth, a sound that traveled across the frozen lake and echoed off distant mountains, a sound that made every hair on Scott's body stand at attention. It was the sound of wild things calling to wild things, pack speaking to pack across distances that civilization pretended didn't exist. The sound was still echoing when Ghost turned those glowing amber eyes toward Scott in the darkness. Not blue, never blue. Amber like fire, like molten gold, like warning lights on equipment you weren't supposed to touch. Scott started noticing other things. The way Ghost paced the property perimeter every morning, stopping at specific points to mark territory with intent that had nothing to do with housebreaking and everything to do with declaring boundaries to threats Scott couldn't see. The way Ghost's body was changing, shoulders broadening, chest deepening, legs lengthening into something built for tireless pursuit across tundra that killed anything soft. The trip to town for supplies became an education in denial. Bill McKenzie flagged Scott down in the general store parking lot, his expression somewhere between amazement and concern. "That's one hell of a pup you got there, Bowman. My dogs won't even look at him." Bill's Husky team, 8 veteran sled dogs who'd run the itinerad twice, were pressed against the far side of their truck bed, ears flat, tails tucked, watching Ghost through the slats like he was the angel of death. Ghost sat calmly in Scott's truck bed, magnificent in his growing power, radiating something that made experienced working dogs choose submission without a single challenge. In the hardware store, Martha Chen's golden retriever, bomb-proof with children and friendly to every creature on Earth, took one look at Ghost through the window and urinated on the floor in pure terror. "Maybe he's got wolf in him?" Bill suggested carefully, the way you'd suggest someone might want to see a doctor about that concerning lump. Malamute wolf crosses aren't unheard of. Scott nodded, bought his supplies, drove home through spring sunshine that felt like accusation. That night, after Ghost had settled by the stove, Scott opened his laptop for the first time in weeks. The satellite internet was painfully slow, but eventually the search results loaded. How to tell wolf from dog. Every article said the same things: longer legs, larger feet, narrower chest, eyes set at more oblique angle, straight tail, never curled, ears smaller, more rounded, coat color irrelevant, wolves came in every shade dogs did. Scott clicked through images: Arctic wolf, timber wolf, gray wolf. Every photograph could have been Ghost in 6 months, Ghost in a year, Ghost fully grown into whatever he was becoming. The final search was the one Scott had been avoiding. Is it legal to own a wolf in Alaska? The answer was very clear. Federal law said no. State law said no. Every result explained that wolves were wildlife, not pets, that possession without permits meant federal charges, that imprinted wolves couldn't be released, that there were no good options once you'd crossed this particular line. Scott closed the laptop and looked at Ghost, who was watching him with those 2 intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand every thought in Scott's head. Ghost stood, crossed the room, and placed his massive head in Scott's lap. The weight was real. The warmth was real. The bond was the realest thing in Scott's life since 12 good men had died because Scott hadn't been good enough to save them. "I know what you are," Scott whispered, fingers buried in fur that was coarser than any husky, thicker than any domestic dog, designed for survival in places that would kill softer things. Ghost's tail moved once, a slow wave that said he'd always known this moment would come, known since the woodpile, since the first breath, since the decision to survive. He'd chosen Scott anyway. And Scott, who'd driven to the end of the earth to escape connection, who'd built walls from guilt and isolation and the belief that he didn't deserve to be the one who lived, chose Ghost right back. Outside, a wild pack howled from somewhere in the hills. Ghost lifted his head, considering, then lowered his head back to Scott's lap and closed his eyes. The choice was made. The grizzly came with the spring thaw, emerging from hibernation with the temperament of something that had slept through winter and woken up furious about it. Scott was checking the trap line, Ghost ranging ahead in that silent way he moved, when the bear materialized from the alder thicket like 600 pounds of hunger wrapped in brown fur and bad intentions. Scott's hand went automatically to the rifle slung across his shoulder, but he never got the chance to unsling it. Ghost was already there, placing himself between Scott and the threat, with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed, as if this moment had been rehearsed in the DNA of his ancestors for 10,000 years. At 3 months old, Ghost was 85 pounds of black lightning, shoulders reaching Scott's hip, built like something designed by engineers who understood that survival meant being able to kill or die with equal efficiency. He stood with his head lowered, hackles raised in a ridge that ran from skull to tail, and from his chest came a sound Scott had never heard before. It wasn't a growl, it was deeper than that, older than that, something that resonated in frequencies that bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the part of human consciousness that still remembered when we were prey. The sound said, "I am the thing that hunts in darkness. I am the thing your ancestors feared, and you will not pass." The grizzly stopped mid-charge. 600 pounds of apex predator, fresh from its den, hungry and irritable, stopped because something 85 pounds told it to reconsider. The bear swayed, testing the air, reading the situation with senses that understood threat assessment better than any tactical manual. What it saw was a young wolf defending pack, and wolves defending pack would die before yielding ground. The grizzly chose life. It huffed once, a sound almost like dismissal, and crashed back into the alders with wounded dignity. Ghost held his position for 30 seconds after the bear vanished, every muscle coiled, ready to make good on promises his body was almost big enough to keep. Only when the forest had been silent for a full minute did he turn back to Scott, and the transformation was immediate. The guardian became a puppy again, all wagging tail and bright eyes, trotting back for the head scratch he clearly felt he'd earned. Scott's hands were shaking when he touched Ghost's fur, not from fear, from realization. Ghost hadn't defended property, he'd defended pack. He'd placed himself between death and family without hesitation, the same way Martinez had done, the same way every member of Scott's squad would have done, the same way Scott would have died for any of them without question. "You're protecting me," Scott whispered, and Ghost's amber eyes said, "Of course, what did you think this was?" That night, lying in bed while Ghost claimed his usual position on the floor beside him, Scott realized he hadn't had a panic attack in 6 weeks, hadn't woken screaming Martinez's name, hadn't reached for the Glock with hands that shook from nightmares where dust and blood ran together in pools that spelled out accusations. He'd gotten out of bed every morning without the crushing weight of dread, because something needed breakfast, needed exercise, needed him. The wild pack howled from the ridgeline, closer than they'd ever been. Ghost rose, moved to the window, and howled back with the voice of something that belonged to them, should be with them, was built for them. The conversation lasted 2 minutes, wolf song echoing across valleys that had carried such songs since ice covered the world. Then Ghost turned from the window, padded back to his position beside Scott's bed, and lay down. The pack called again, invitation clear. Ghost's ears swiveled toward the sound, but his body didn't move. He'd chosen his pack. It happened to be a pack of one damaged human, but family was family. Dr. Emma Hartley arrived unannounced 3 days later, driving up in her truck with the look of someone who'd been working up courage for a difficult conversation. Scott knew her from his first town visit, when he'd needed to confirm Ghost wasn't carrying diseases from his time in the cold. She'd been professional then, curious, had run basic tests and declared the puppy healthy. Her expression now was different. "Scott," she said, declining coffee, sitting at his table with her hands folded, like she was preparing to deliver bad news about a terminal diagnosis. "We need to talk about Ghost's DNA." Scott felt his chest tighten. "You ran tests." "I ran tests," she confirmed, and her eyes were kind but unflinching. "Scott, Ghost is pure Canis lupus arctus, Arctic wolf, 100%, not a hybrid, not a dog with wolf content, a wolf." The silence stretched between them like the moment before an IED detonates, when you already know, but your brain hasn't caught up to the reality that will change everything. "He saved my life," Scott said finally, simply, because it was the only truth that mattered. Emma's expression softened. "I know, and that's why we need to figure out what happens next before someone else figures out what he is." Scott looked through the window to where Ghost was sprawling in a patch of sun, magnificent and impossible, the wolf who'd chosen a broken human over his own wild birthright. "He's my family," Scott said. "That's what happens next." Emma nodded slowly, like she'd expected this answer, maybe even hoped for it. "Then we need to talk about the law, because family or not, what you have out there is about to become everyone's problem." Outside, Ghost rolled in the grass, jaws open in what looked absurdly like joy, living proof that salvation sometimes came with teeth and chose you anyway. Emma spread the lab results across Scott's kitchen table like evidence at a court-martial. Genetic markers, chromosome analysis, mitochondrial DNA sequences that meant nothing to Scott, but everything to the law. The paperwork was clinical, precise, damning. 100% Canis lupus arctus, Arctic wolf. No dog DNA, no hybrid gray area, just pure wild predator wearing the shape of Scott's salvation. "The pack probably moved den sites during that February blizzard," Emma explained, her voice gentle in the way doctors use when they're about to tell you there's nothing more they can do. "Arctic wolves sometimes have to relocate if conditions threaten the pups. Ghost was probably too weak to keep up, got left behind. It happens. Nature doesn't have room for sentiment." Scott looked at Ghost through the window. 110 pounds now, 4 months old and still growing, winter coat coming in thick enough to survive temperatures that would kill humans in minutes. His frame was massive, built for endurance across frozen tundra, for taking down caribou, for leading packs across territories measured in hundreds of miles. He was magnificent. He was illegal. "Federal law is explicit," Emma continued, and Scott could hear the apology in her voice. "The Endangered Species Act, the Lacey Act, state wildlife regulations, they all say the same thing. Possession of a wolf without proper permits is a federal felony. Alaska Department of Fish and Game has jurisdiction. Mandatory surrender once they know." "They know?" Scott's voice sounded distant, like someone else was speaking through his mouth. Emma's silence was answer enough. "Dr. Marcus Webb is a wildlife biologist. He was in town last week, heard about your unusual husky, asked if he could take a look during a routine visit. I thought maybe he could help, maybe there was precedent, maybe—" She stopped, shook her head. "He confirmed what Ghost is. He has to report it, Scott. It's not personal, it's protocol." Scott's world narrowed to a pinpoint, the way it had narrowed in the seconds before the ambush, when everything was still fine, but some animal part of his brain already knew the trajectory of the next 5 minutes would end in blood and screaming and survival that felt like punishment. "What happens to him?" The question came out flat, tactical, the voice he'd used to request casualty evacuation. Emma's hands twisted together. "There are 3 options. Wildlife sanctuary in Montana. They have facilities for imprinted wolves who can't be released, but Ghost would spend his life in an enclosure, never run free, never—" Next option. Reintroduction program. They'd try to integrate him with a wild pack, teach him to hunt, to be wild again. Emma's voice dropped. "Scott, he's too imprinted. He thinks he's part of a human pack. Reintroduced wolves like him don't survive. They approach humans looking for connection and they get shot, or they starve because they never learned to hunt cooperatively with their own kind. It's essentially a death sentence with extra steps. Scott's chest felt like it was being crushed under weight measured in tons. Third option. Emma looked at her hands. Euthanasia, if he's deemed dangerous or if there are no available sanctuary spaces. It's considered humane compared to a slow death in the wild. The word humane hung in the air like a curse. There was nothing humane about killing something because you'd made it illegal to love. Scott stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor with a sound like a rifle bolt. He walked to the window where Ghost was watching a raven harass a squirrel, his amber eyes tracking movement with the focus of something built for survival. Ghost sensed Scott's attention and turned, tail wagging once, expression open and trusting in a way that made Scott's throat close. "He saved my life," Scott said quietly. "Not metaphorically, literally. I had a loaded gun and a plan and no reason to see another morning. Then he showed up dying, and I spent one night keeping something else alive, and it was enough to make me want to see if I could manage another day, then another, then 6 weeks without nightmares, then getting out of bed because someone needs me, not because I haven't found the courage to end it yet." Emma came to stand beside him. "I know. That's why I'm here instead of calling Fish and Game directly. But Scott, the law doesn't care about miracle recoveries or emotional support animals or bonds that transcend species. The law sees an apex predator that weighs over 100 pounds living next to a town with families and children. The law sees liability. The law sees something that needs to be controlled. The law is wrong. Maybe. But wrong or right, it's still the law, and Marcus Webb files his report in 72 hours. Scott pressed his palm against the window glass, and Ghost stood, trotted to the other side, pressed his nose against Scott's hand with only glass between them. The gesture was so human, so impossibly full of understanding, that Scott felt something crack in his chest that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with certainty. "No one is taking him," Scott said, and his voice carried the same absolute conviction he'd used to promise Martinez he'd get them all home safe. He'd been wrong then. He wouldn't be wrong now. Emma's hands twisted together. "There might be a way," she said carefully. "It would require documentation, expert testimony, precedent research, and probably a miracle. But if you're serious about fighting this, you need to start building a case now, before Webb files, before this becomes official. Tell me what you need." Emma looked at Ghost, then back at Scott, and something like hope flickered across her face. "Everything," she said. "We need everything. And Scott, we need it to be airtight. Because once Fish and Game comes with that surrender order, you get one chance to make them see what I see, what you see." "What do you see?" Scott asked. Emma's silence was answer enough. "Family," she said simply. "I see family. Now we have to make them see it too." After she left, Scott sat on the porch while Ghost sprawled beside him, massive head resting on Scott's knee, amber eyes reflecting the late afternoon sun. Somewhere in the hills, the wild pack howled. Ghost's ears swiveled toward the sound, but he didn't move, didn't answer, didn't waver. "No one is taking you," Scott promised again, and Ghost's tail thumped once against the wooden planks, a sound like a heartbeat, like an agreement, like a wolf's way of saying, "I know, and I'm not leaving either." The war was coming. This time, Scott would be ready. Scott's laptop glowed in the pre-dawn darkness, tabs multiplying like strategies in a combat briefing. Arctic wolf pack dynamics, imprinting psychology in apex predators,
case studies of human-wildlife bonds, scientific papers with titles like Behavioral Flexibility in Canis Lupus and Cognitive Architecture of Interspecies Social Recognition. He read like his life depended on it, because Ghost's life did. The wild pack returned on the third night, materializing from the tree line like smoke given form. 5 wolves, silver and gray and white, pure wilderness moving through Scott's property line with the confidence of things that had never learned to fear humans. They called to Ghost with vocalizations that made Scott's chest ache with their complexity, their invitation, their promise of belonging. Ghost stood at the fence line Scott had hastily reinforced, every muscle trembling with conflict. The pack's alpha approached, a massive silver male who moved like violence contained in fur, stopping 10 feet from the fence. The 2 wolves locked eyes, and some conversation happened in frequencies Scott couldn't hear, in body language older than human speech. Then Ghost turned away from everything he should want and trotted back to where Scott stood on the porch. He climbed the steps, pressed his shoulder against Scott's leg, and watched his own kind disappear into the forest without him. The choice was made again, chosen deliberately with full knowledge of what he was refusing. Scott's hand found Ghost's fur, gripped tight. "I know," he whispered. "I know what you're giving up." Word spread through town with the efficiency of small communities where everyone knew everyone's business and made it their own. Bowman's got a wolf out there, a real wolf, not a hybrid, not a dog with wolf blood, but the genuine article. Opinion divided along fault lines as predictable as tectonic plates. Bill McKenzie stopped by with a case of caribou meat from his freezer. "Heard you might need supplies," was all he said, but his meaning was clear. Martha Chen crossed the street when she saw Scott in town, pulled her children closer, fear naked on her face. The sheriff, a Vietnam vet named Tom Bradshaw, knocked on Scott's door and looked at Ghost for a long time before saying, "You got 72 hours before Webb files official. Make 'em count." Emma came every week, ostensibly for wellness checks, actually documenting everything. She filmed Ghost responding to commands, measured his temperament in controlled situations, recorded his interactions with Scott in meticulous detail. Her notes became a paper trail of evidence: non-aggressive, highly trainable, bonded, stable, safe. Scott trained Ghost like he was preparing for special operations. Sit, stay, heel, down, leave it, come. Basic obedience any dog could learn, except Ghost learned in single sessions what took dogs weeks. Scott taught boundaries, marked invisible lines Ghost wouldn't cross without permission, taught social behaviors, how to approach strangers calmly, how to accept touch without tension. Every session was recorded, time-stamped, added to the growing file that was either salvation or fantasy. The Veteran Affairs Office in Fairbanks was a 4-hour drive Scott made in early May. Dr. Lisa Chen had been his assigned therapist for 6 months, though he'd only attended 3 sessions before disappearing into the wilderness. She remembered him, remembered the hollow-eyed man who'd answered every question with the emotional range of someone already dead. "You look different," she said when he walked into her office. "I got a reason to live. I need you to write it down." Dr. Chen's letter took 3 hours to craft, filled with clinical language about trauma recovery, attachment theory, therapeutic intervention, measurable improvement in PTSD symptoms. But the last paragraph was pure human understanding. "In 15 years of treating combat veterans, I have never witnessed such profound psychological transformation. Ghost has accomplished what therapy, medication, and intervention could not. He has given Captain Bowman permission to survive." The documentation grew. Medical records showing 6 months without panic attacks. Testimony from Bill about Scott's reintegration into community. Emma's behavioral analysis. Photographs of Ghost with children at the fence line, calm and controlled while toddlers shrieked with excitement. Video of Ghost refusing raw meat until given permission, demonstrating impulse control that would shame most domestic dogs. Scott trained Ghost like he was preparing for an insertion into hostile territory, because that's exactly what this was. Every piece of evidence was a defensive position. Every testimony was ammunition. Every recorded interaction was proof that love could train wildness without breaking it, that family transcended biology, that some bonds were worth fighting bureaucracy and law and fear itself to protect. The town meeting was scheduled for May 23rd. Webb's report would file May 25th. Scott had 2 days to convince people that the wolf sleeping on his porch was less dangerous than their fear, more valuable than their regulations, more important than precedent. May 22nd, Scott sat on his porch reviewing documents while Ghost dozed in the evening sun. 120 pounds of impossible situation wrapped in black fur. A truck pulled up the drive, then another, then 3 more. Bill climbed first, followed by Tom Bradshaw, then Emma, then veteran Scott recognized from town but had never spoken to. 10 people total standing in his yard like an informal squad. "Heard you're going to war tomorrow," Bill said. "Figured you could use some backup." Scott looked at these people who owed him nothing, who were choosing to stand beside him against institutions and fear and laws that made perfect sense until you understood what they would destroy. His throat closed around words that wouldn't come. Ghost stood, walked to Bill, sat calmly while Bill's hand found his fur. The gesture was permission and trust and proof, all without words. "Thank you," finally Scott managed. "That's what you do for pack," Bill replied, and his eyes said he understood exactly what Ghost had taught Scott about choosing family. You show up when it matters. Tomorrow, they would fight for the impossible. Tonight, they were ready. The photograph captured something that shouldn't exist. Scott and Ghost on the frozen lake at sunrise, man and wolf in perfect silhouette against mountains painted gold and pink. Ghost's head level with Scott's hip, both of them gazing toward the same distant horizon. The tourists who took it thought they'd captured a man with an unusually large husky. By the time they posted it online with hashtags about Alaska's wild beauty, the comments had already identified what Ghost really was. The image went viral in 48 hours. National news picked it up. Wildlife experts weighed in. Animal rights activists debated ethics. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game could no longer pretend not to notice. The enforcement notice arrived by courier on May 24th. 1 day ahead of schedule. Official letterhead, legal terminology, 72 hours to surrender the wolf to state custody or face federal charges. Failure to comply would result in forced removal, criminal prosecution, and immediate euthanasia of the animal. The language was cold, procedural, resigned to eliminate argument through the weight of institutional authority. Scott read it once, folded it carefully, and prepared for war. The town hall meeting that night was standing room only. Scott arrived with his documentation in a worn military duffel, Ghost walking calmly at his side on a lead that was more symbol than necessity. The room divided instantly, people shifting away from Ghost or toward him, depending on which side of fear they lived on. Martha Chen stood first when public comment opened. "That animal is dangerous. We have children in this town, schools, playgrounds. You can't tell me a wild wolf doesn't pose a threat." "I can tell you exactly that," Bill McKenzie countered, rising with the authority of someone who'd lived in Alaska for 40 years and understood its rhythms better than any regulation manual. "I've watched that wolf for 3 months. Brought my grandkids to meet him. He's got better manners than most dogs and more control than any husky I've trained. What's dangerous is letting fear make decisions that destroy something good." 3 other veterans stood in succession, each sharing their own battles with PTSD, their own failures with conventional treatment, their own understanding of what Ghost represented. Tom Bradshaw spoke about returning from Vietnam to a country that couldn't see past the uniform to the shattered man inside. "Scott found something that works," he said quietly. "Maybe it's unconventional, maybe it doesn't fit the forms, but it works, and that matters more than whether it makes bureaucrats comfortable." The debate raged for 90 minutes before State Wildlife Officer David Torrens arrived with backup. He carried a surrender order, a transport crate built for dangerous animals, and the expression of someone who'd done this job long enough to feel nothing while doing it. "Captain Bowman," Torrens said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "I have legal authority to remove the wolf from your custody. We can do this cooperatively, or we can do this the hard way." Scott stood, and Ghost stood with him, a synchronized movement that spoke to months of partnership. "You're not taking him. This isn't a negotiation." "You're right, it's not, because there's nothing to negotiate. He's my family. You don't surrender family." Torrens's jaw tightened. "Law is law, Captain. What you have there is a wild apex predator, 120 pounds of animal that belongs in the wilderness, not in someone's living room. Your feelings don't change biology. Your trauma doesn't override public safety concerns. I have children too. I have a duty to protect them from threats, even threats people have convinced themselves are pets." The words hung in the air like cordite smoke. Scott felt the old familiar tightness in his chest, the combat readiness that said violence was one heartbeat away. But then Ghost pressed against his leg, solid and calm, and the panic receded. "He saved my life," Scott said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "Not metaphorically, not as therapy. He literally saved my life when I was planning to end it. He's saved it every day since. He's protected me from bears, chosen me over his own kind, learned everything I've taught him. You want to talk about duty? My duty is to protect him the way he's protected me." Judge Patricia Morgan entered through the side door, unexpected and unofficial. She carried a leather briefcase and the expression of someone who'd spent 3 days researching case law until her eyes burned. "Before we proceed with forced removal," she announced, "I'd like everyone to review precedent regarding service animals, emotional support animals, and therapeutic wildlife programs currently operating under special permits in 6 states. Torrens turned sharply. "Your Honor, with respect, this is outside your jurisdiction. It's outside everyone's jurisdiction, because it's never happened before, which means we're not bound by precedent. We're creating it." For 2 hours they debated while Ghost lay calmly at Scott's feet, demonstrating more control than most humans in the room. Morgan presented cases of therapeutic riding programs using wild-caught mustangs, rehabilitation facilities keeping permanently injured raptors, veterans programs employing service dogs that failed temperament tests. She built a framework where love and training mattered more than species designation. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived halfway through, examined Ghost from across the room, and finally approached for direct assessment. Ghost accepted his inspection with perfect composure, responding to commands, demonstrating the boundaries Scott had taught him. Webb's expression shifted from skeptical to troubled to something approaching wonder. "I've never seen anything like this," Webb admitted finally. "Theoretically, it shouldn't work. Imprinted wolves don't integrate into human society this successfully, but theory doesn't account for whatever happened between these two." Torrens remained unmoved. "Beautiful story, doesn't change the law. I have an order, I have a duty." "And I have a family," Scott replied, "so if you want him, you'll have to go through me." The standoff crystallized, two men representing two different kinds of certainty. Behind Scott, the community he'd tried to escape stood ready to fight beside him. Beside him, Ghost sat calm and loyal, proof that some bonds couldn't be explained, only honored. Morgan closed her briefcase with a sound like a gavel. "Then we take this to court," she declared. "Emergency hearing, tomorrow. Until then, no one removes that wolf. And Officer Torrens, I suggest you bring better arguments than 'because the law says so.' This case deserves more than procedural compliance." Torrens stared at Ghost, then at Scott, then at the room full of people who'd chosen sides based on something that couldn't be measured or regulated. Finally, he nodded once. "Court, then. But, Your Honor, the law exists for a reason. When this goes wrong, and it will go wrong, the blood is on everyone who chose sentiment over safety." He left with his transport crate empty, his certainty intact, and Scott still standing with Ghost beside him. In the parking lot afterwards, Bill clapped Scott's shoulder. "Tomorrow's the real fight." Scott looked down at Ghost, who gazed back with amber eyes that held all the wisdom of wild things that chose civilization anyway. "Tomorrow we prove love is stronger than fear," Scott said. Ghost's tail wagged once, and in that simple gesture was all the faith that either of them needed. The screaming cut through the parking lot debate like a knife through Kevlar, high-pitched, terrified, coming from Eagle Ridge Trail less than a quarter-mile away. Every head turned toward the sound, that universal human recognition of someone in mortal danger. Scott's combat instincts cataloged the situation in seconds. Multiple voices, at least one child, panic escalating, something very wrong happening very fast. Ghost's entire body went rigid, ears forward, every sense locked on the distant crisis. He looked at Scott with eyes that asked a question older than domestication, older than the treaty between wolves and humans that had created dogs 10,000 years ago. This was the moment. This was everything they'd built, everything they'd argued, everything they'd become, crystallized into a single choice. Scott unclipped the lead. "Go," he commanded. "Help them." Ghost exploded into motion like black lightning given purpose. 140 pounds of Arctic wolf hit top speed in 3 strides, vanishing into the tree line with the fluid efficiency of something built by evolution to cover ground that would exhaust lesser predators. Scott ran after him, Torrens and Webb close behind, the crowd from Town Hall spilling into the parking lot and following because humans are drawn to catastrophe like moths to flame. They found the scene on Eagle Ridge Trail where it curved past a blind corner thick with alders. A family of 3, father down with blood streaming from his shoulder, mother crouched over a 6-year-old girl, both screaming, as 700 pounds of grizzly decided whether injured humans were worth the calories. The bear was a rogue male, too thin for this time of year, desperate enough to consider prey it would normally avoid. Ghost hit the clearing like a tactical strike. He didn't attack the bear, he positioned himself between predator and family, dropping into a defensive stance that belonged in wildlife documentaries about pack behavior and territorial defense. The growl that emerged from his chest made the bear pause, made every human in earshot feel their spines turn to ice, made it clear that this was not a bluff. The bear rose to full height, a wall of brown fur and muscle that outweighed Ghost 5-1. It roared, the sound designed to intimidate anything with survival instincts. Ghost held his ground, didn't advance, didn't retreat, just held the line between threat and family with the absolute certainty of something that had already decided it would die here if necessary. The standoff lasted 15 seconds that felt like hours. Ghost lunged forward 3 feet, jaws snapping, a feint that made the bear step back. Ghost lunged again, each movement calculated to push the threat away from the vulnerable humans behind him. The bear swiped, massive paw connecting with Ghost's shoulder and opening 3 parallel gashes that immediately welled blood. Ghost barely flinched, just repositioned, kept his body between bear and child, kept making it clear that getting to the humans meant going through a wolf who had no intention of yielding. The bear made its calculation. Injured prey wasn't worth fighting an opponent willing to sustain damage. The grizzly dropped to all fours, huffed once in what might have been respect or dismissal, and crashed back into the forest with wounded dignity intact. Ghost held position for 30 seconds after the bear vanished, blood dripping from his shoulder onto trampled grass, every muscle coiled and ready. Only when he was certain the threat had passed did he turn toward the family. The mother instinctively pulled her daughter closer, fear overriding gratitude, because Ghost was still a predator covered in blood standing over prey-vulnerable humans. Ghost looked at them for one long moment, then turned away, walked past the injured father without a glance, walked past the sobbing child who represented everything his instincts should want, walked directly to Scott and sat at his feet, waiting for assessment, waiting for approval, waiting for the only opinion that mattered to him. Scott dropped to his knees, hands finding Ghost's wounds, checking severity with the automatic efficiency of combat medicine. 3 deep gashes, painful but not critical, would need stitches and antibiotics. Ghost leaned into Scott's touch, let out a breath that might have been relief or exhaustion or satisfaction at a job well done. The crowd that had followed from town hall stood frozen, watching something that shouldn't exist, watching a wild predator ignore vulnerable prey to return to the human who'd given him permission to be what he was, watching proof that training and trust could transcend instinct without destroying it. David Torrens stood beside Dr. Webb, both men staring at Ghost like he'd just rewritten everything they knew about wildlife behavior. "I've never seen anything like that," Torrens said, his voice stripped of certainty. "Defensive display, strategic positioning, restraint under injury, and then he just walked away from them, came back to Bowman." Webb shook his head slowly. "Theoretically impossible. Imprinted wolves don't demonstrate that level of impulse control, don't distinguish between pack defense and predatory opportunity, don't—" He trailed off, watching Scott wrap his jacket around Ghost's wounds with hands that were steady despite everything. "Don't love like that." The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance. The mother held her daughter while explaining to her that the big wolf had saved them, was a good wolf, was a hero. The father, conscious despite his injuries, kept looking at Ghost with the expression of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew about the line between wild and tame. Tomorrow there would still be court, still be laws and regulations and institutional resistance to anything that didn't fit established categories. But tonight, on Eagle Ridge Trail, Ghost had proven what Scott knew since that February blizzard when a dying puppy chose to survive and a dying man chose to save him. Love transcended species. Family transcended biology, and some bonds were worth rewriting the law to honor. The emergency hearing lasted 6 hours. Judge Morgan presided over a courtroom packed with witnesses, experts, and townspeople who'd chosen sides based on what they'd seen on Eagle Ridge Trail. The family Ghost saved sat in the front row, the father's arm in a sling, the daughter Mia clutching a drawing she'd made of a big black wolf with kind eyes. Torrens presented his case with professional precision, citing federal regulations and wildlife management protocols. Webb provided counterpoint, his scientific testimony now colored by reluctant wonder at behavioral patterns that defied conventional understanding. Emma submitted months of documented observations. Dr. Chen appeared via video conference to explain how Ghost had accomplished what modern psychiatry could not. The permit granted was unprecedented, hedged with conditions that would make it functionally unique in American wildlife law. Reinforced enclosure meeting federal specifications, monthly inspections by Fish and Game, liability insurance that cost more than Scott's annual income, public education programs teaching responsible human-wildlife interaction. One incident, one complaint, one moment of aggression would void everything. Scott accepted every condition without hesitation. Whatever it takes, he told Morgan, whatever keeps him home. The Healing Paws Wild Hearts program emerged from necessity and became something larger. Scott spoke at VA hospitals about alternative approaches to PTSD treatment, about bonds that existed outside traditional therapy frameworks, about the healing that came from being needed by something that chose you back. Dr. Chen documented Ghost's impact in a paper published in the Journal of Psychiatric Innovation, titled Interspecies Attachment as Intervention, a case study in combat-related PTSD recovery. The medical establishment debated. Veterans started asking questions about their own options. The first winter under permit arrived with the familiar darkness and cold that had once felt like a death sentence. Scott and Ghost patrolled the property together at dawn and dusk, checking the reinforced fence line, documenting everything for the monthly inspections that Torrens conducted with diminishing skepticism. Ghost had grown to his full adult size, 150 pounds of muscle and intelligence that moved through snow like he was born for it, because he was. The Saved family visited every Sunday. Mia brought books and read to Ghost through the fence, her small voice steady and fearless while Ghost lay on his side of the barrier and listened with the patience of something that understood the value of simple companionship. Her parents watched from a careful distance at first, then gradually moved closer as weeks passed without incident. By November, they were bringing sandwiches, staying for hours, treating Scott and Ghost like the heroes they'd become. Bill arrived one Saturday morning with his entire Husky team, 8 Husky dogs who'd once cowered from Ghost's presence. Time and exposure had transformed terror into something approaching acceptance. The dogs still gave Ghost respectful space, but they no longer fled. Bill's grandson played in the snow while Ghost supervised from inside his enclosure, amber eyes tracking the child's movements with protective vigilance that belonged to pack guardians since the beginning of pack dynamics. The anniversary of the rescue arrived with clear skies and temperatures that dropped to -40. Scott and Ghost walked out onto the frozen lake at sunrise, their breath visible in the crystalline air, mountains painted in shades of pink and gold that made the world look newly created. The aurora borealis had started early that winter, green and purple curtains dancing across the sky in patterns that ancient peoples interpreted as spirits of wolves running through heaven. Scott stopped in the center of the lake where ice went down 40 feet and the silence was absolute. He thought about the man he'd been 1 year ago, the loaded Glock on the counter, the certainty that he didn't deserve to be the one who survived. He thought about 12 good men who died under his command, about guilt that it felt like gravity, about isolation that seemed like the only honest option left. Then he tilted his head back and howled. Not a perfect wolf howl, too human and too rough, but honest in its intention. A call to the wild things that had saved him, a thank you to whatever cosmic accident had dropped a dying wolf puppy against his woodpile on a night when he most needed something to keep alive. Ghost joined him immediately, his howl pure and ancient and perfect, harmonizing with Scott's clumsy attempt in a way that created something beautiful from imperfect components. The sound traveled across the frozen lake, echoed off distant mountains, became part of the endless conversation between wild things and the wilderness that made them. In the distance, a pack answered, Ghost's biological family, still ranging through territory that included Scott's property, still calling to the wolf who'd chosen a different kind of pack. Ghost listened, but didn't move, didn't waver, didn't question the choice he'd made and kept making every day. They walked back to the cabin as the aurora intensified overhead, ribbons of light that made the snow glow green. Inside, Scott built up the fire while Ghost sprawled on the sheepskin rug that had become his preferred spot. Scott made coffee, reviewed the month's inspection reports, checked the schedule for next week's speaking engagement at the VA hospital in Anchorage. That night, Ghost curled beside Scott's bed as he had every night for a year. Both of them bore scars now. Ghost's shoulder carried 3 parallel marks from the grizzly. Scott's chest carried the marks of surviving when he didn't want to. Both of them had been saved by the other in ways that couldn't be measured or explained. Both of them had found home in the least likely place with the least likely companion through a bond that existed outside every framework humans use to categorize relationships. Scott reached down, found Ghost's fur in the darkness, felt the steady breathing that meant security and presence and family chosen rather than given. "We made it," Scott whispered. "Both of us, we actually made it." Ghost's tail thumped once against the floor, a sound like a heartbeat, like agreement, like a wolf's way of saying what words couldn't capture. Outside, the aurora danced. Inside, 2 survivors slept in the peace that only comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly who you're supposed to be with, regardless of what anyone else thinks makes sense. Some bonds aren't meant to be understood, they're only meant to be honored. And in honoring them, we discover that healing lives in the spaces between species, between wild and tame, between the life we planned and the salvation we didn't know we needed. Family isn't defined by biology, it's defined by who shows up in the blizzard, who chooses to stay when leaving would be easier, who sees your scars and decides you're worth fighting for anyway. Scott had found that in a dying wolf puppy. Ghost had found it in a man who'd forgotten he deserved to live. Together, they'd built something that transcended every boundary, proved every skeptic wrong, and demonstrated that love, real love, the kind that demands everything and gives more, knows no species, no regulation, no limitation except the ones we choose to honor. They'd chosen each other. They'd keep choosing each other. And that choice made all the difference. True healing cannot be prescribed or regulated. It emerges from unexpected connections that defy categorization. When 2 souls recognize each other across impossible divides, the question isn't whether they should be together, but whether we have the wisdom to honor bonds that transcend our understanding of what family should look like. Sometimes the most profound healing comes from the most unexpected places, and family isn't defined by biology, it's defined by choice, dedication, and refusing to give up on each other. If you like our stories and would love to see more, kindly like and subscribe to our channel.